to the late Dr. Jay Newman, who passed away in 2007. Jay Newman was a professor at the University of Guelph in Ontario, and he was a longtime member of the Gilbert and Sullivan Society of New York, and also author of numerous articles on W.S. Gilbert and the Savoy operas. And in his will, he left the Gilbert and Sullivan Society of New York a sum of money for us to produce the Jay Newman Memorial Lectures on Gilbert and Sullivan. And tonight, this is the 9th in our series of lectures. We have had 8 of them previously, and they've been well attended and very much appreciated by those who attend them. It's a good way to spread the news and the history of Gilbert and Sullivan, and for people to get to know a little more about Gilbert and Sullivan and their works. So tonight we are very happy to have as our lecturer Marc Shepherd. Marc is the co-editor with the late Michael Walters of the Variorum Gilbert and Sullivan, a marvelous multi-volume treasury of analysis and history of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, and Marc will tell us more about that as he speaks with us. So, Marc, it's all yours. Welcome.
Okay, terrific. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully, let's just see here if I can get this to work. And someone just confirmed that you do see the screen.
Yes, we do.
All right, terrific. Thank you. So a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, Ian Smith, who founded the International Gilbert and Sullivan Festival, asked me to give a talk in Harrogate as part of a symposium that I think went on for a couple of days. And I was really delighted when Dan and the council asked me to give the same talk here for the Gilbert and Sullivan Society. I think that virtually all of our audience tonight is bigger than the audience I had in Harrogate, and almost entirely different people. So I'm glad that I can reach a new audience with it. It's kind of appropriate. If you can see my face in the little window, the left side of my screen is a bunch of books. All of those books, virtually all that you can see, are Gilbert and Sullivan related. Below that you can't see is a wall of cabinets, also containing a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan. And so this is, so to speak, the room where it happens. I'm going to speak for in the neighborhood of 40 minutes. And then for those who haven't given up, we will be happy to take questions at the end. And I'm really delighted that we can do this virtually. I know there's quite a few people here that if we had done it the traditional way in one of our meeting rooms here in New York, there's an awful lot of people here today that wouldn't have been able to be here. So I'm glad we were able to do it. So with that in mind, I will get started. So it's not exactly a new idea that the literary works we love are at times poorly served by the books that transmit them to us. As far back as the 3rd century BC, the Library of Alexandria was a major center of textual scholarships. Even then, it was recognized that the great works of the major Greek poets had survived in corrupt manuscripts that were sorely in need of correction. Shakespeare is surely the most edited author in English. Indeed, it's possible that more effort has been expended upon scholarly Shakespeare editions than upon every other English writer put together. In Shakespeare, there's a confluence of the two conditions that underlie almost all serious textual criticism. The first is that his works come down to us in editions that are obviously corrupt. And the second is that Shakespeare's works are important enough that his uncorrupted texts are worth the effort of recovery. The idea of applying these techniques to the works of Gilbert and Sullivan is comparatively recent. I certainly don't claim to be the first to have noticed that Gilbert's librettos and Sullivan's scores are available in a plethora of editions that differ from each other for unexplained reasons. But until the last part of the 20th century, nobody seems to have done much about it. Or if they did, it was without access to the most important sources or the rigor to evaluate those sources properly. Today, I want to talk about the Variorum Gilbert and Sullivan, which I edited with my collaborator of many decades, Michael Walters, who sadly passed away a few years ago with only one volume of the Variorum published out of a projected 5 volumes. The term Variorum, which is Latin for various, refers to an edition that presents the variant states of a text with editorial commentary. This use of the word has been around since at least the early 18th century. Here, for example, is a page from the Variorum Romeo and Juliet, published in 1871. You'll see that the main text occupies the top 1/3 of the page and commentary the bottom 2/3. This is a commonly used layout employed by many editors over hundreds of years. It took Michael Walters and me 35 years to produce our first volume of 4 operas, Thespis through HMS Pinafore, which we finally published in 2015. I was not sober or wary the entire time. Nevertheless, textual criticism, the branch of the humanities to which this sort of work belongs, is notoriously time-consuming. For instance, the Braudy Brothers critical edition of the Gilbert and Sullivan full scores has been active since 1971 and has published just 3 operas, Trial by Jury, HMS Pinafore, and Iolanthe. Ronald Braudy still hopes to produce another 1 or 2 volumes, but has unfortunately long ago given up hope of completing the full set as he had originally planned. If you're thinking that I had better pick up the pace, you'd be right. The Variorum Gilbert and Sullivan sorts through all of the variant forms of the librettos and seeks to establish the texts that Gilbert and Sullivan intended to be performed. Just to give you an idea of how much material there is, our first volume of 4 operas is 800 pages long. If you've ever encountered a variant passage in the G&S librettos or vocal scores and wondered where it came from, this is the shop for it. We also include all of the pre-publication drafts, including a considerable amount of material never published before. Here, for example, is a plot draft of Thespis. It can be found in the Gilbert papers in the British Library, but nobody before us, as far as I know, took the trouble to transcribe it and publish it as we did. You may gather from this example that Gilbert's penmanship is not always easy to decipher. Most of us were taught, and having been taught, believed that the D'Oyly Carte Opera Company were the official conservators of the Gilbert and Sullivan texts. All sorts of standard ad libs were enshrined in the little red prompt books that the company hired out. In the UK particularly, it was common for performers to follow these books religiously. Retired company members extended their careers as directors of amateur operatic societies, and part of the cachet they offered was the assurance that their expertise had been handed down unaltered over many generations. Who needed a critical edition when we had dear old D'Oyly Carte instead? I do think that, for the most part, D'Oyly Carte truly believed that the texts, as they performed them, were the versions that Gilbert and Sullivan themselves had authorized, with certain well-known exceptions, such as the company's extensive revision of Redigor in the 1920s. But the men and women who ran the company were not historians or textual scholars. They had neither the time, the training, nor the aptitude to chase down the provenance of every little piece of tradition. And of course, it was always self-serving for the company to claim that they were the uniquely qualified custodians of a tradition that had been passed down from Gilbert and Sullivan themselves, even if it wasn't quite true. If you are a Gilbert and Sullivan performer, you have surely had the experience of the first day of rehearsal, where members of the cast show up with different editions and there's a blizzard of confusion once it is discovered that the texts are not all the same. Typically, directors resolve these conflicts in one of 2 ways. Either they choose the reading that appeals to them aesthetically, or They choose the reading that they've decided is historically correct by some standard, but usually without the evidence to back it up. Sometimes there is a member of the cast who claims to be the expert. Perhaps you're familiar with the passage in the Act 1 finale of Iolanthe, whereas traditionally performs, the peers sing P.A. Parliament, as if wondering how to spell the word. And the fairies reply P.A.R. Parliament. This is not in most librettos. It is in more recent vocal scores, of which I'm showing an example on the screen. However, it isn't in any score published in Sullivan's lifetime, which might leave you thinking it was a 20th century doily card invention. Well, is it? I was in a production of Iolanthe a few years ago where the self-appointed expert lectured the cast that this was a totally spurious tradition with no legitimacy whatsoever. I didn't want to get into an argument with him, but in fact, he was entirely mistaken. On the screen now, I'm showing an excerpt from the prompt book of the original production of Iolanthe at the Savoy. It's a bit difficult to read, but this is what it says. At P.A. Parliament, peers turn their heads to Queen, as inquiring how to spell the word. When Queen has replied P.A.R. Parliament, they resume writing, and so until the end of the verse when they put up their notebooks. Now, here is well-nigh irrefutable evidence that this bit of business, which probably some of you have performed yourselves, dates originally from the first production in 1882. Now, let me be clear that I do not believe you ought to perform the opera this way just because Gilbert did. And in fact, our director in that production a few years ago excluded it. Whether on the authority of the self-appointed expert of the cast, I'm not sure. But if you reject this because you consider it inauthentic, you'd be demonstrably wrong. Now, I absolutely respect the right of directors to make textual choices on aesthetic grounds, even where I know that Gilbert and Sullivan had different ideas. Directors make such choices all the time, for instance, by restoring songs that Gilbert and Sullivan cut, or by cutting unworkable material in an overly long opera like The Grand Duke. But if you want to know what Gilbert and Sullivan wrote, that is a question of fact, not of opinion. And from facts are ascertained from research, not aesthetic preference or tradition. Once you have the facts, of course, you're free to do whatever you want with them. Why does such confusion exist? Well, it turns out that Gilbert himself was largely responsible for it. Early in his career, when he was still struggling for recognition, Gilbert discovered that managers were more likely to accept a printed text for production than a manuscript one. When a new opera went into rehearsal, Gilbert arranged for his libretto to be printed right away. He continued this practice even after he was long past the point of submitting plays for approval. This was far more efficient than paying a copyist to write out separate parts for each actor. These handwritten copies were known as sides because only one side of each part was included. Thus, the actor would see only his lines, but cues from every other part. It was surely a confusing way to work. Given that Gilbert knew his librettos were going to be printed for publication anyway, it made sense to do so sooner, to have the benefit of using them from the start. During rehearsals, both Gilbert and Sullivan altered their work more or less constantly. It was, of course, not practical to transmit every little change to the printer as soon as it happened. Hence, by opening night, the libretto Gilbert began rehearsals with and the text ready for performance could have diverged considerably. Before publication, they had to be brought into alignment. You might have thought that Gilbert carefully compared the printer's proof to the rehearsal text with meticulous care to ensure that they agreed. In fact, what seems to have occurred was only the most cursory review. Where entire songs or verses were added or deleted, these changes generally were transmitted to the printer. Hundreds of little changes were not. How do we know this? The most obvious proof comes from librettos and vocal scores that were published contemporaneously and yet do not have the same words. In early editions of Trial by Jury, there are 2 extra lines for the usher that are not in the published score. By the way, I apologize that a few of my visual examples are not the best scans, but I felt a flawed image was better than none at all. I've tried to highlight the passages of interest in red, and I'll also read it. Anyhow, here are those 2 extra lines for the usher. This blind devotion is indeed a crusher. Pardon the teardrop of the simple usher. Music for these extra lines was never published in any edition of the vocal score, but they remained in the libretto, not just for the entire first run at the Royalty Theatre, but also through the first major revival at the Savoy in 1884 and 1885. So for at least a decade, these 2 extra lines were printed, though it would have been apparent to anyone that they were not being performed. Whether they ever were performed, we can't say. In Sullivan's autograph manuscript, it appears that a page was removed where this couplet would have occurred. Whether he removed it at a late stage of rehearsals or after opening night, we just don't know. What is certain is that by the time the vocal score was published, about 2.5 months after the premiere in 1875, this couplet was no longer in existence, though the librettos continued to print it. Just after the usher's couplet, there is another unfamiliar line. The counsel sings, "Call the plaintiff." As you probably not know, the line should read, "Where is the plaintiff?" I'm now showing an excerpt from Sullivan's autograph manuscript. Even if you don't read music, you may be able to make out the words, "Where is the?" And the plaintiff is on the next page, which I'm not showing. And you can see here, there's no sign of revision. Barring the highly unlikely possibility that Sullivan trashed the entire number and rescored it after opening night, you would have to conclude that the words "call the plaintiff" were never heard in any performance, and that it was "where is the plaintiff" from the very beginning. You might wonder if trial by jury was an anomaly, as Gilbert and Sullivan were still getting to know each other, and the pattern of revision and publication was not yet in its settled form. Well, here's a similar example from Redigor. As first published, and in fact for decades thereafter, the opening chorus in most librettos went like this: "Fair is rose as the bright May day, soft is rose as the warm west wind, sweet is rose as the new mown hay, rose is the queen of maiden kind." If you know Redigor, then you know that each line has an extra "the" that Sullivan didn't set. I can't show you Sullivan's manuscript this time, but as in the trial by jury example, I assure you, it shows no sign of revision, and the published vocal score does not have the extra occurrences of the word "the." We can be sure they were never sung. I'll give one final example of this kind from the Pirates of Penzance. This opera was unusual in that neither the vocal score nor the libretto was published until 6 months after opening night in London. Both documents had the same publisher, Chappell, and there was presumably ample time to ensure agreement between the two. And yet, the libretto in the Act 1 finale ends with this short ensemble. You can see it's a reprise of the Pirate King's song, "For we all are orphan boys," etc., etc. This was not in the vocal score, and there is no sign of it in Sullivan's manuscript. If it was ever performed, it must have been an early casualty, and yet here it is, published in a libretto 6 months after the London opening. I've sometimes been asked whether this variation between the libretto and the vocal score could have been deliberate. Maybe Gilbert considered his librettos literary creations, and he wanted them to reflect his conception of the piece before the practicalities of stage production forced him to make changes he might not have really wanted. But it is hard to believe that Gilbert considered the lines on the screen so brilliant that it would be a stain on his literary legacy to lose them. After all, it's the 4th appearance of the Pirate King's song in Act 1, and these words are just a repeat of earlier words with altered pronouns. I am convinced it was simple carelessness that it took the librettos so long to catch up with decisions Gilbert had already made in the theater. Reginald Allen's The First Night, Gilbert and Sullivan purported to print the librettos as they were performed on their opening nights. As far as I know, Reginald Allen was the first to study the Gilbert librettos analytically and publish his findings with scholarly rigor. He also established the incomparable Gilbert and Sullivan collection at the Pierpont Library in New York, where I've spent hundreds of productive hours. If Michael Walters and I have improved on Reginald Allen's work, it is only because we are standing on his shoulders. Having said that, Reginald Allen's claim to have identified the opening night texts is simply not true. He relied on the assumption that every change to the libretto was promptly transmitted to the printer, which we now know was not the case. In fairness to Reginald Allen, many of Sullivan's manuscripts were then in private collections and weren't available for study. And it doesn't seem to have occurred to him that the history of the libretto could be learned from a music score. This error has continued to bedevil more recent researchers. Here I must tread lightly, as Dr. Ian Bradley is still very much with us. In fact, he was in the audience when I gave this talk originally, and there was hearty laughter when this slide appeared on the screen. As I did with Reginald Allen, I must give Dr. Bradley credit for what he has achieved. His complete annotated Gilbert and Sullivan is now in its 3rd edition, which testifies to its enormous success. And Dr. Bradley has continued actively to improve it. Unlike Michael Walters and me, he has completed a lot more than just a single volume of 4 operas. Dr. Bradley also has a new book out that discusses the importance of religion in Sullivan's life. I heartily recommend that you look it up. Having said that, in his book of annotations, Dr. Bradley has often made the same mistake as Reginald Allen, in that he believed printed librettos were an accurate reflection of the performance text at a given time. Like Reginald Allen, he did not always consult the available musical sources that could have shown this was not the case. As an example of the mischief this can cause, consider Elsie's response in the Act 2 finale of The Yeoman of the Guard, just after she has learned that Fairfax is alive and has come to claim her as his bride. As we've come to know it, Elsie sings just one line. No, no, recall those words. It cannot be. In the complete annotated Gilbert and Sullivan, Dr. Bradley asserts that in the early performances, Elsie had a longer solo, including these extra lines. Leonard, my Leonard, come, oh, come to me. Leonard, my own, my loved one, where art thou? I knew not how I loved thine heart till now. Well, the story here is one you should be familiar with by now. These 3 lines do not appear in any vocal score, and Sullivan's manuscript shows no sign of the revision that would have been necessary had they been performed and later deleted. Besides being almost certainly untrue, there is another problem with Dr. Bradley's statement. He says these lines were heard at, quote, early performances in intervals so vague that it could encompass anywhere from a few days to many years. For instance, would the 1897 revival of Yeoman count as early? Truth is, I have no idea in which early performances Dr. Bradley believed the text in question was performed. As much as I admire the complete annotated Gilbert and Sullivan and would recommend it to anyone, this sort of imprecision is for me its least attractive feature. I should add that when I gave this talk in Harrogate, Dr. Bradley accepted my critique with grace and humility. Without a doubt, the GNS community is better off for his many contributions, which go far beyond this one book. But I digress. My examples so far have concerned lyrics set to music. But what about the dialogue? We can't compare the published librettos to Sullivan's manuscript or published vocal scores because 19th century music scores didn't include the dialogue. You may be aware that American vocal scores often did include the dialogue, but as Gilbert did not supervise these editions, they don't tell us very much. We can, however, compare published librettos to the original production prompt books, which have survived for most of the operas. Now, the main purpose of a prompt book, then as now, was to record the staging in detail. Most performers today don't consider themselves bound by Gilbert's stage directions, and I'm not here to argue that they should be. However, prompt books transmit another kind of information that we do care about. Bear in mind that when Gilbert prepared the original productions, he was there in 2 capacities, as director and as author. If in his capacity as author, a beneficial change to the text occurred to him, he, in his capacity as director, would tell the performers to alter it, and the production prompt book would be the first place that the decision was recorded. I'm going to give an example from the Mikado. I'll warn that it is a bit convoluted, but I hope that you can follow it. Here is a page from the first night libretto. You'll notice that the Little List song is in its original position at the bottom of the page and with its original lyrics after Coco finds out that the Mikado has inquired why Titty-Poo has had no executions in a year. Coco sings, as it seems to be essential that a victim must be found, rather than as someday it may happen that a victim must be found. Now, in the passage highlighted in red at the top, notice that Pish-Tush enters alone to deliver the Mikado's letter. Now, here is the same passage in the original production prompt book. This is a particularly rich passage from which many lessons can be drawn. The first thing to notice is that within Coco's first speech, the original stage direction was enter Pish-Tush, which is how it was printed in the first night libretto we just looked at. And this has been altered in ink to specify that Pooh-Bah enters as well. Now, here is a page from the second issue of the libretto, still dating from the original 1885 production. You can see that Coco's song is gone from the bottom of the page, and the stage direction has been altered as the prompt book indicated. But now let's go back to the prompt book and look at a few other passages. Pish-Tush's line is altered to read right below the entrance, "We are the bearers of a letter from His Majesty from the Mikado." This is an unfamiliar change, one that never reached publication in any version of the libretto. As we usually hear it, Pish-Tush still says, "I am the bearer of a letter from the Mikado," a vestige of Gilbert's original idea where Pooh-Bah was not present at this point. Now comes Coco's line where he says, "I thought it would come," and there's a marginal insertion, "sooner or later," which all of us are used to hearing. But now I go back to the revised libretto from the 1885 production, the one altered to show Pooh-Bah's entrance, and the words "sooner or later" aren't there. Later in the same speech, Coco says, "Unless somebody is beheaded within 1 month, the post of Lord High Executioner will be abolished." And the words "somebody is beheaded" are deleted, and the words "an execution takes place" is written in the margin. This is another change that was never published. A couple of lines later, Coco says, "There is no help for it. I shall have to execute somebody." And there's an interlinear addition, the words "at once." This is in fact how we usually hear it today. But going back to the revised 1885 libretto, we see that the words "at once" aren't there. Back to the prompt book. There are several other revisions at the bottom of the page that never made it into the published text. Pooh-Bah says, "Well, it seems unkind to say so, but as you're already under sentence of death for flirting, everything seems to point to you." Coco replies, "To me?" And there's an interlinear addition, "Go along with you." A couple of lines later, Coco says, "Why not?" And there's an interlinear addition that was later canceled. And underneath the strikeout, you can read that Coco says to Pish-Tush, "Do you hear that?" And then finally, at the bottom of the page, Pooh-Bah interjects, "Self-decapitation is the first law of nature." And maybe you'll agree with me that it's not a sad thing that that particular line was lost to history. So eventually, a revised libretto was published, and you can see the words "sooner or later" and the words "at once" were added in Coco's two speeches, but the other revisions we've discussed were not. This is a pattern that repeats itself for most of the operas. We find that revisions to the dialogue that date demonstrably from the original production don't make it into print right away, and sometimes not for many years. But the early prompt books also contain extra lines that were never published at all, and we usually don't know why. From these examples, we can see that Gilbert was clearly not preoccupied with ensuring that the texts that he authorized for publication corresponded at any given time exactly to the texts that he authorized for performance. Gilbert's librettos were popular, which means they remained in print more or less constantly throughout his lifetime, with new and revised editions appearing regularly. Most of the time, it appears he did not proofread new editions carefully, and printed librettos had only an approximate correspondence to the text authorized for performance. The haphazardness of the revisions that appeared or failed to appear in his lifetime suggests that he usually delegated these tasks to other people. By the time that Gilbert made his last exit in 1911, you might say there were 3 versions of each opera. One was the literary version found in published librettos. Another was the musical version found in published vocal scores. Finally, there was the theatrical version, which was preserved in company documents like prompt books and conductor scores, or, well, even in the performers' heads. By the end of World War I, the texts were out of control. Rupert D'Oyly-Carte, assigned J.M. Gordon, his then stage director, to thoroughly revise the librettos, to bring them into alignment with what he understood to be Gilbert's original intentions. This program was widely publicized before the company's London season in 1919, its first since Gilbert's death. Cart told the Observer, quote, "The operas will be produced under my personal supervision by Mr. J.M. Gordon, who worked with Sir William Gilbert at the last revivals at the Savoy. They will be played precisely in their original form, without any alteration in the words or any attempt to bring them up to date." Gilbert, in some of the revivals, himself modified a few of his original points. In Patience, for example, he altered the threepenny bus young man to the twopenny tube young man. But we are working on the original book, and we will accordingly revert to the threepenny bus young man. Now, this was not exactly the whole truth. As we know, Rupert D'Oyly Carte approved substantial modifications to Redigor, which were in no sense of the word original. But for the most part, I think Rupert D'Oyly Carte was true to his word. The attempt to return to the original texts as Gilbert intended them may have been partly a marketing scheme, but I also believe it was mostly sincere. Of course, J.M. Gordon was not a textual scholar, and what he didn't do was, as we would say in school, to show his work. Audiences were simply asked to accept on faith that Gordon's texts were the original ones. As the author Tony Joseph has said, his decision in every case was crucial, for the texts, as J.M. Gordon eventually settled them, were the texts that the company would use unchanged throughout its time thereafter. Over the next several years, most of the operas received new editions of the libretto and vocal score from Chappell, the authorized publisher. These new editions largely agreed with each other to a much greater extent than they ever had done before. Many variants that had appeared in early prompt books finally made it into print for the first time. One of my favorite examples comes from Act 2 of The Pirates of Penzance. On the screen is an excerpt from the first published libretto. At the top of the page, you can see where the Major General says, "I thank you for your proffered solace, but it is unavailing. At what time does your expedition march against these scoundrels?" This is a much shorter version of the familiar line shown at the bottom of the page. "I thank you for your proffered solace, but it is unavailing. I assure you, Frederick, that such is the anguish and remorse I feel at the abominable falsehood by which I escaped these easily deluded pirates, that I would go to their simple-minded chief this very night and confess all, did I not fear that the consequences would be most disastrous to myself. At what time does your expedition march against these scoundrels?" The longer speech was not published until about 1920, but there are 5 surviving 19th century and early 20th century prompt books, including the 1880 prompt book from the 1880 prompt book from the first London production. All 5 of them have handwritten versions of the longer speech that J.M. Gordon published, sometimes with multiple layers of revision. But none of them exactly correspond to the familiar version that J.M. Gordon ultimately settled upon. Here's an example from one of those early prompt books. You're not going to be able to read it, but I have blown it up. In this version, the Major General says evaded rather than escaped, and he says that he fears the consequences would be most serious rather than disastrous to himself. So on the one hand, J.M. Gordon was obviously right to include a version of this speech in the settled text. But how did he arrive at the version that we now consider definitive? We simply don't know. However, Gordon probably had access to knowledge and documents that are not available to us. I would not necessarily say that Gordon's decisions were necessarily incorrect, just because in some cases we can't say how he arrived at them. The examples I've given today involve cases where we can demonstrate that a libretto did not faithfully transmit the authorized performance text because it is contradicted by another, more accurate document, such as a music score or a prompt book. But we must always acknowledge that we do not have perfect information. For some troublesome passages, we may not be able to say for sure that what Gilbert wanted, perhaps because a key document has been lost or never existed at all. Nevertheless, there are a few general principles that can, I think, get us closer to Gilbert and Sullivan's intentions. Any libretto editor must be a music editor as well. For words that were set to music, Sullivan's manuscript scores and published vocal scores often provide a more accurate history of the text than librettos do. The printed text of a libretto is seldom an accurate index to the performance practice at the time of its publication. For instance, one should not assume that a Pirates libretto published in 1888 was the text of Pirates as the company performed it in 1888. When Gilbert changed his words, the best he could have done was to tell the printer immediately, but frequently he did not. Published librettos lagged the authorized performance text, sometimes for many years or even decades. I've spoken today about librettos because the Variorum Gilbert Sullivan is a book of words. But in case you were wondering, many of the principles I've spoken about today apply to Sullivan's music as well. For most of the operas, Sullivan's vocal scores were not published until several weeks or even months after the first performance. So they tended to reflect a more settled state of the work than the first published librettos did. However, just like Gilbert, Sullivan was not always meticulous about ensuring that every little change he approved of made it into print as soon as he approved of it. His scores, like Gilbert's librettos, sometimes took many years to catch up with changes that we know from other evidence had been made in performance long before. Gilbert and Sullivan were practical men of the theater. Their aim was to produce the operas for critical and popular success, not to establish texts for later generations. They would probably be surprised to learn that we're ever puzzled over what they intended. To them, there wasn't any puzzle. They directed their own works, so they never had the experience of encountering conflicting readings and not knowing what to do. It is because these puzzles are so numerous and so fascinating that Michael Walters and I started working on the Variorum Gilbert and Sullivan, a task that I'm a bit embarrassed to admit has taken up a good deal of my adult life. Finishing the remaining 4 volumes will probably take most of the rest of it. Before I close, I want to say a word about the commercial side of a project like this. When Walters and I began, we had no idea how we would find a publisher for a subject so esoteric and of such limited interest, aside from the fervently dedicated but nevertheless very small community of Gilbert and Sullivan enthusiasts. I'm quite sure that no publisher would have tolerated a 5-volume critical edition. If our idea had found a commercial audience at all, we would surely have had to omit a great deal of material. We thought about publishing the Variorum ourselves, but when we started out, traditional self-publication came with a lot of drawbacks. There were high upfront costs, and we had to guess how many books we'd sell. Guess high, and we'd be stuck with a large quantity of inventory that could take years to dispose of. Guess low, and our audience would be out of luck unless we were willing to invest in a reprinting. Fortunately, a new kind of self-publishing came to our rescue in 2002. Lulu.com publishes books on demand, which means there is no inventory, no minimum order quantity. The book simply doesn't exist until someone buys it, and the finished product looks as fully professional as the output of any traditional printer. As authors, Walters and I paid nothing up front. Lulu.com doesn't charge except when the book is ordered. They also handle shipping and collect credit cards, things I would rather not be bothered with. It is because of this that we were able to publish an 800-page book containing just 4 operas. Self-publication through an on-demand service like Lulu relieved us of the need to make agonizing trade-offs of being forced to omit material that might be of interest only to very few. We don't really expect anyone to read it all cover to cover any more than you'd read a dictionary or an encyclopedia straight through. It's more of a reference book to dip into over many years. If your interest has been piqued, I invite you to visit lulu.com and search on Variorum. The book will come straight up. The first volume of the Variorum covers only the first 4 Gilbert and Sullivan operas, Thespis through HMS Pinafore. We're about to have a Q&A, but I might as well answer one question I'm often asked, and that I knew would come up today. When will Volume 2 be coming out? Alas, I cannot tell you that publication is imminent. Volume 2 contains what will be the biggest and knottiest chapter of them all, the one devoted to the Pirates of Penzance. No opera, no Gilbert opera, comes close to having so many sources and so many variant forms of the text that must be documented. The only thing I can tell you is that I'm working on it as fast as I can, but no faster. Anyhow, I thank you for your attention, and now I'm happy to take any questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to push the reactions button to raise your hand if you have a question, and then I'll unmute you. Okay, let's first have a question from, hold on one second. I'm going to try to, okay, I'm going to unmute Ron Orenstein. Hold on one second. Go ahead, Ron.
Okay, first of all, Mark, thank you. I'm fascinated by this, and I devoured volume 1, so volume 2 can't come fast enough. Let's say, I understand what's involved. But the question I'm curious about is a lot of the minor textual changes, like the extra thes in Fair as Rose, for example. I wonder if there's any evidence that this wasn't Gilbert. This might have been just Sullivan, that as he set the music, he found that the original, that he had to drop a word or two here and there just to fit his musical ideas, and whether he had some license from Gilbert to do that. Do we have any evidence that that he was able to, he sort of had that permission from Gilbert to play around a bit?
No, I can't recall any example, either the case you raised or others, where they went back and forth. But I have always believed that, yes, Sullivan took the liberties that every composer of text has always done to make small alterations of that kind where he needed to. I mean, I could have spoken for 45 minutes, just examples like that, where there's just a little word or something like that. And I personally can't believe that every time he wanted to do that, he had to ask permission. I think he took the liberties that composers have always taken in such situations.
That sounds sensible, yes.
Is that the end of your question, Ron?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, one moment. Okay, can we have a question from Don Smith, please?
Yes, I might point out that Gilbert was not exactly enthusiastic about revising his librettos. There's a letter from Helen Dorley Cart, I think about the time of the 1907 revivals, asking Gilbert to go through and edit all of his librettos so they could be sure that they were performing exactly what he wanted. But there's evidently no response from Gilbert, and he certainly didn't do it at that time.
Yes, I've seen that. I'm pretty sure I've seen that exact letter, and you're right. Gilbert didn't do that. There is correspondence where she asked about specific things, and when he was asked a specific question, he always answered it, but he was not willing to go take the time and go line by line and correct them.
Thank you, Don. Can we have a question from Cliff Coles, please? One moment. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yeah.
can.
Thank you very much. I too read your first volume cover to cover. And I too can't wait for the next ones to come. But I have two questions. One has to do with any emendations or edits that you may want to impose on the text or revise. Two of them come to mind immediately, and the final couplets of Elsie's solo have always been laid out as 4 lines each, when in reality they're just 2 couplets, and but they've never been set that way. And I also think of the trio of all the young ladies I know, where each soloist is given, it says solo Phyllis, solo Lord Talala, instead of having those characters to the left of the text. And I was wondering about, do you ever want to fix those things?
Oh, sure. That's a great question. There's always a trade-off where you're making a change and speculating, and how confident are you? I will say that one of the things I do is I do bring the printed text into agreement with what was set to music. I mean, there are some cases where Gilbert laid out things in parallel, but in fact, Sullivan set them sequentially. And the reverse happens. Sometimes Gilbert laid out things sequentially and Sullivan set them in parallel. And what I'm endeavoring to do is to create the text as performed, not the text as conceived before it had music. Where it's a matter of speculating, I'm absolutely willing to do that if I'm like really super duper sure that, hey, this thing does not make sense, but it you can just see it was intended to be something else. I have to admit the the examples that you specifically asked about, I don't have those in front of me right now. I don't even remember what I've done with that, what I've done with them, because I'm not working on those operas at the moment. But I can tell you in Thespis, there were some cases where there's only one libretto of Thespis, and there were things that I considered to be incoherent, but I felt it was obvious enough what was originally intended. And so I amended, even though I had no source to back me up. Of course, I noted that I'd done it. You can read my justification and say I was right or wrong, but I try to not go too far in that direction. And usually I feel I have some basis for it. I think you had a second question.
Yes. My second question has to do with your choices as far as the mountebanks and His Excellency. Now, you called this the Variorum Gilbert and Sullivan, and I have to tell you, I really appreciate how Sullivan has been incorporated into this volume. But why not choose Haddon Hall or the Rose of Persia and show us how the processes of those authors differed or were the same, or other reasons for tackling His Excellency and the mountebanks?
Oh, sure. I will say in all candor that was Michael's idea, and I can pick on him because he's not with us anymore. I think Michael's feeling was that both of those librettos were written for Sullivan. Well, in their final version, they weren't, but they were started as librettos for Sullivan. And so Michael argued, and I mean, obviously I ended up agreeing with him that it was worthwhile to include them. I have absolutely, like, say I finished the Variorum, the operas that have been laid out, and I have more time left. What should be the next thing I do? And I've thought about, I could go ahead and do works like Haddon Hall, or I could do more Gilbert, right? I mean, I could do Fallen Fairies, Haste to the Wedding. First of all, I'm not sure if I'm going to get that far. I'm old enough that I have to be realistic. There are more things I'd like to do than years left in which to do them. But in any event, that's why we drew the line where we did.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cliff. If anybody else has a question, please press the reactions button to raise your hand. Looks like we have you. let's have a question from Larry Byler, please. Let's see. I'm trying to unmute you, Larry.
Okay, I can see I can talk, but I can't turn on my video.
Ah, now you can. Now you can.
Okay, okay. Hey, it worked.
There you are.
Yeah, Mark, great job. I did want to ask you, Greg Anderson and I are in fact working on Rose of Persia, and we are facing many of the same questions that you are. So one of them is not only the sources of the various sources, prompt books, libretti, vocal scores, and what have you, but when. If you're looking for a definitive version of it, a definitive version at what time, and what kind of how did you go about answering that question with Variorum?
Uh-oh, hold it. Mark is muted.
You're muted, Mark.
Hold on one second. Sorry about that. See if I can figure this out. There we go.
Not sure how I got muted there. So I guess you're saying, how do you decide, like, of the many states of the text, which one you lay out as being the definitive or final one?
Well, not just that, but definitive or final at what point in time? And I guess, yeah, final may be based on today, what you would consider final today. But I'm sure that as time progressed, there were revisions and so-called finals. Do you? I'm none like the others. I have not read the Variorum cover to cover, so I don't maybe take that up as part of your analysis. Fair
enough. No. I mean that is a question that I talk about. So one of the this is like for centuries, people who edit have wrestled with this problem because over time, many people a lot smarter than I have found that the best way to present a text is, you have one main text and then you've got footnotes, and there can only be one main text, right? And ultimately, I don't care how good your footnotes are, it's easier to read the main text because we read linearly. We're conditioned to do that, right? So what I decided and was that the main would be the final version that was performed when both Gilbert and Sullivan were alive. Okay, so I drew the line. That was where I drew the line. So for instance, the changes that Gilbert made after Sullivan was dead, I decided those are not going to be in the main text, but anything that was done while Sullivan was alive, that was where I was going to draw the line. Other rationales are possible, and you could also try and do something experimental. I mean, you're familiar with my vocal score of the Grand Duke, and in that I took what I call the kitchen sink approach. I threw in every performable variant that there is, so that then understanding no one will choose them all, especially since a couple of numbers are printed twice different ways, and it was meant to be, here's the kitchen sink, take what out of it what you want. And that's another way you can go about it. And I think there is a difference with a music score and a libretto. A libretto is mainly a reading exercise. Like I don't think anyone's going to take the Variorum into rehearsal and read from it to rehearse with. But a music score very much is for that, and you have to be practical about what you can do in rehearsal. And that might lead to different types of decisions. And one of my big complaints, and David Russell Hume and I have argued about this, the Oxford edition of Redigor, all of the deleted material is in an appendix at the back of the book, which means first of all, one of the big reasons, not the only, but one of the big reasons people buy that edition is because they want to be able to restore the deleted material. And yet, if you want to, you have to keep flipping back and forth to the back of the book. I find that monumentally impractical and unhelpful. And David and I have had a polite disagreement about that, but and he's not the only one that has done it. The Browdy Brothers Iolanthe, it's so thick that it takes 3 volumes. And so the first volume's Act 1, the second volume's Act 2, the third volume is the commentary and appendices. Fold Your Flapping Wings is in an appendix in the third volume. So if you're a conductor, you'd have to carry the third volume into the pit for you just so you could haul it onto the stand for that one number in the middle of Act 2. Very impractical, and not, I worked on that edition. Some of my ideas are in it. That's one idea I do not agree with.
Yeah, and in that particular example, he'd have to do a very quick change because Fold Your Flapping Wings is an attacker.
That's right. Totally. Yeah. I think very impractical, but I mean, the Variorum's a little different because it's a book that you read in an armchair. You're not taking it into rehearsal.
Sure. I was the thrust of my question was what do you consider the mainline version, and how did you arrive at that decision? And you answered that. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Ron.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Yeah. I hear you.
Yeah, this is sort of follow up on what I was asking earlier, Mark. I mean, in a lot of Shakespeare textual stuff, a lot of time is spent talking about copyists and who besides Shakespeare would have been the one who would make this change or that change. In the case of these operas, presumably you would have one set of people who were working on getting the libretto into printed shape, someone else who's lining up the score and printing the vocal score, and then probably a third person who's handwriting notes in the prompt books. To what extent do you have any feeling that within any of these groups there was any kind of communication, or was it more a matter of one of the reasons that some of these variants may have stayed in the libretto is because once the score was published, nobody printing the libretto went back and said, let's match this up with the score, and the same stuff in the prompt books.
Although I didn't go into that level of detail, that is exactly what I believe is the case. That Sullivan had his people who did his scores, and Gilbert had his people that did his librettos, and I don't believe that they communicated much, and I think that explains a good deal of it. I agree with you.
What about the handwriting of who in the prompt books?
Oh, so the handwriting in the prompt books, you usually can't tell who it is. I mean, in one prompt book of Yeoman, I saw some entries that did appear to be Gilbert himself, but generally you can't tell who made the entries. But what you can tell is you can date them. For example, someone would start creating a prompt book during rehearsal, and let's say in the middle of rehearsal they delete a song, and that song was deleted in rehearsal, and it's in the prompt book, X'd out. You can clearly tell this was the prompt book that was being used in the original production. Now, yeah, granted, the person writing is usually not Gilbert, and that person could have made mistakes. But printers make mistakes too. I mean, the fact that it was done by somebody else doesn't mean that you reject it. You have to look at things and weigh them and understand that these people, they were professionals. They were hired to do a job conscientiously, and I think by and large they did.
What would be your treatment of a passage of dialogue, say, that only appears in a prompt book, not found anyplace else?
Oh, I am usually reluctant to admit things like that, unless it's pretty obvious that the failure to amend the libretto was an error. I mean, there's the famous example in Act 2 of Redigor where Gideon Kroll stayed in, even though all the others were amended. The problem is you saw those examples from the Mikado where there's that was only one page, okay? There's many examples of lines that you could add that are in prompt books. And if you do that, you end up with a version of the Mikado that a lot of people would be uncomfortable with. It would be so far from what they recognize. And I think that those lines are going to be footnoted. You can decide for yourself what relevance they have. But for whatever reason, Gilbert and people who were carrying out his wishes chose not to publish them.
I suppose Thespis, of course, you have the problem with all the stuff that Terence Reese did.
That's right. Well, I mean, Terence Reese, is just one of many speculative versions. And if I included all of those, like, where do you stop? I mean, his speculation was better than most people, but still it was, his best guess.
Yeah, it was based on press reports too.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Mark. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Ron. If anyone else has a question, please press the reactions button and raise your hand.
I think Dan is waiting. Dan Kravetz is waiting.
Are you again? Let's see. I don't find you.
Yeah, part of the problem, Sam, is I don't think you can see all the windows at the same time.
Okay, all right, never mind. Let me just ask to unmute.
Thank you. I just wanted to identify the anonymous voice that you just heard. You've heard Mark, you've heard me, but the third voice emanating from headquarters belongs to Sam Silvers. Sam is the one who introduced all the people with questions, and he is the membership secretary of the Gilbert and Sullivan Society of New York and has played a very important part in arranging this evening's proceedings. You can see his face now with the name Christine St. Pierre, but that's not Christine. Christine St. Pierre is blonde and Sam Silvers is not. So
we should thank Christine for providing this account for us to use for the meeting. And also Christine has helped me. Here she is. Christine, has helped me with the hosting, although all of the hosting errors are mine alone.
Yeah. I'd also have one little thing that I want to discuss, getting back to Mark's. It's something that has I've lost sleep over from time to time. It has to do with the quartet in Act 2 of the Gondoliers with Marco, Giuseppe, Tessa, and Janetta. And Gilbert's libretto has Tessa sing, "If she married Messer Marco, you're a spinster, that is plain." To which Janetta replies, no matter if I can get at her, I doubt that her mother will know her again. Now, I have not seen in any score the words "that is plain." Whatever was going on with Sullivan's setting of the words, whether he meant to eliminate those 3 words and 3 notes that could go with it, or there's some other reason. But as a conductor and music director, I have at times asked the person singing the role of Tessa to add the words "that is plain" and 3 notes that I have given to her, just to keep Gilbert's line intact, and to provide the rhyme for plain and again. And I don't know if this is making me a sacrilege, someone who has performed a sacrilege by doing so. But I figured, I thought that for whatever reason, Gilbert was cheated out of 3 very important words. Do you have any comment on that, Mark?
Yeah. So first of all, in that exact passage, to the best of my recollection, and I don't have my Gondoliers sources in front of me, Sullivan chose not to compose those words. I can give other examples where Sullivan deliberately omits words for a musical effect, and as a result of that, the rhyming scheme is impaired, destroyed, sacrificed, whatever. This is something I wouldn't say he did on a regular basis, but I mean, there's multiple examples where he did that. One example that's just in my head, there's a line in Pirates where Mabel sings, "to dream of such exceeding gladness," but Gilbert actually wrote, "to dream of goodness knows how much exceeding gladness." And Sullivan just decided to delete the words "goodness news" so he could get this long melisma on the word "such." So he sacrificed the scan in order to achieve a purely musical effect. And that's just the one that comes into mind. If I did a little more thinking, I know there are others. I mean, it's just something he did from time to time.
This is the first time I've heard of that goodness knows, and it sounds interesting to to put it in there. But well,
I mean, you can fit it into the notes that are unlike, the example you gave where you had to compose extra notes. You can fit the goodness knows into there, but it's just not what he decided to do, and it's not what we usually hear.
Mhm. Yeah. We can take more questions if there are any.
If anyone
Just
has a
make sure,
question,
Sam, you're looking at the other page in case there's someone raising their hand on the other page.
when the hand goes up, it comes to the top of my
Oh,
screen.
oh,
So
does it? All right.
yeah. Push the reaction button and raise your hand if you have a question for Mark. Well, it looks like that concludes the Q&A.
Yes, and before we wrap things up, I want to express heartfelt thanks to Mark for letting us hear his lecture, even when we could not provide a live venue for him to do so. It's very interesting and informative, and very thought-provoking, and we look forward to getting the remaining volumes of the Variorum as soon as they are available, because it's just an outstanding, fascinating read to show how this material has evolved over so many decades. And thanks again to Sam Silvers for helping get this, and to Christine St. Pierre, who is the actual manager of our Zoom process, and we think that she has done a great job, and we are grateful to that. And
let me interrupt you for a moment. Peter Zavon, did you still have a question?
All I was doing was clapping my hands.
Oh,
The two
okay.
icons are very similar.
yes,
Sorry about that.
okay. Well, everyone deserves a good round of applause for those who made this thing happen this evening. And we are grateful that we had more than 40 participants, which is very, very impressive. The way we were able to publicize this on the internet, on Facebook and elsewhere. And we would ask those of you who are not members of the Gilbert and Sullivan Society of New York to please consider becoming members. The membership dues are very reasonable. If you're in New York, you will get 10 meetings per year of live musical entertainment. And whether you're in New York or not, you will get 10 issues a year of the Palace Peeper, full of the latest news, scandal, and gossip about the world of Gilbert and Sullivan. I am the editor, so that's also my responsibility. And we hope that we will actually get our meeting schedule out. If there is going to be a meeting in September, we